Welcome to the Helsus Global South Encounters with me, Franklin Obiodun, currently Professor of Global Development Studies at the University of Helsinki as the chair. If you would like to stay connected between the encounters, I would like to draw your attention to our X account, LinkedIn account, and just ecological political economy, the Helsus Global South blog, links to which you can now see in the chat box. Dubai is once again in the news. This city-state is the source of so much heat, both literally and figuratively. That is, it is difficult to escape its influence, much like climate change. The host of the just ended COP28, Dubai's very legitimacy was questioned right to the end. Media reports in The Guardian, Time, and Financial Times claim that the city economy is built on oil, that the people are oppressed, and that such illiberalism cannot be allowed to mix with the fight for a clean and green society. How could the cathedrals of fossil fuels in the world, the primary driver of the global climate crisis, be allowed to host a conference of the parties that must be fundamentally opposed to fossil fuels? For proponents of total fossil phase-out, the very presidency of COP28 was conflict of interest personified. Matters were not helped when Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber, chairman of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company and president of COP28, was reported to have denied the very signs of fossil phase-out. These accusations were energetically rejected by UAE leaders. Sultan Al Jaber clarified that he had been quoted out of context and pointed out that the Western media was seeking to undermine his presidency of COP28. With his many financial entanglements in oil investments, the picture is rather complex, a drama extensively covered on the pages of the Financial Review. Other global leaders backed UAE leadership. Dr. Fatih Birol, who is currently the executive director of the International Energy Agency, seemed to agree with Dubaian leadership when he said in a BBC interview that to address the fossil question, it is critical to bring the world's fossil cities and societies to a central place in the sustainability discussion. Yet that has not stopped the debate, whether in the lead up to, during, or after COP28, torrents of criticisms have been leveled against Dubai. Breathless, a BBC documentary, drew attention to widespread toxic gas and cumulative environmental pollution in Dubai and the UAE broadly. We have delivered a paradigm shift that has the potential to redefine our economies. We operationalized loss and damage and started to fill the fund. We mobilized more than 83 billion US dollars in new financial commitments. Those were the words of Dr. Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber when he announced that all parties had agreed with no objections to a final COP28 statement, which the media highlights only calls for transitioning away from fossil fuels. But for Sultan Al Jaber, COP28 has clearly made substantial progress in the march towards a cleaner, safer, and greener world. Even so, Dubai's moral standing as the host of COP28 would always be controversial. These tensions and contradictions, to be clear, plague climate activists and activism too. It seems activists see that the money for loss and damage can help, but the source of that money, the sale of fossil fuels, can harm. Is that a case of trying to eat their cake and still have it, or is it a radical dialectical philosophy of a unity of opposites? If such a clash of fundamentally irreconcilable positions could bring progress according to this philosophy, then could that principle also apply to Dubai and the Gulf states? Is a rapprochement possible? And if possible, is it desirable? Only time will tell. In the meanwhile, local media sources have been overwhelmingly and consistently positive about sustainability in Dubai. Indeed, a recent study of articles about sustainability in Dubai shows that 83% of the media stories dominated by UAE sources portray the Dubai Sustainable City project in positive terms. These, of course, are media representations, but such popular representations of sustainability, development, and sustainable development have been historically game-changing, although relatively underappreciated by scientists. Sustainability analysts must appeal not only to the rational, but also to the emotional, to the visual, to the scientific, and to the popular. There is no better person to help us to do so than Jim Krane, the Wallace S. Wilson Fellow of Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in the US. A well-trained journalist with more than 20 years of experience, Krane has been a correspondent for the Associated Press, and his reportage has been widely published and publicized in the leading global presses, such as the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times. A PhD from the University of Cambridge, Dr. Krane's book, City of Gold, Dubai and the Dream of Capitalism, has been described as, quote, even-handed, unquote. According to academic assessment in the Energy Journal, Krane's book on Dubai, quote, established his reputation as a leading scholar of the region, unquote. That region is the focus of Dr. Krane's latest book, Energy Kingdoms, Oil, and the Political Survival in the Persian Gulf. Why must we focus on energy kingdoms? Are the criticisms of the Persian Gulf's leadership of climate questions justified? If, as Krane has argued elsewhere, there is an existential tension between stability and sustainability in UAE, what does today's COP28 commitment mean for Dubai, for the UAE generally, and for the global South more broadly? To help us unpack and answer these questions, please join me in welcoming Dr. Krane to the Global South Encounters. The microphone is yours, Jim.
All right. Well, super nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation to Dr. Franklin Obeng Odum and Sanchi Mehra. And let me share my slides here. All right. So fantastic introduction here. A lot to unpack in the introduction. I am going to try to go into a lot of that stuff, but if I miss something out, please, let me know. I mean, it looks like a small group here, so I am happy to take questions as I move through the slides. if I say something that you don't understand or that you want me to explain more fully, please go ahead and just put your hand up or shoot me a message. Actually, I probably won't look at the chat, but if you raise your hand, I should see that. Or maybe Sanchi, if you let me know if there's a question, I'm happy to pause and take it. So yes, so as Franklin said, I'm a former journalist. I did my PhD after about 20 years in the news business. So I spent about 7 years or so in the Gulf, in and around the Gulf, based in Iraq first and then in Dubai. I covered the region, spent time in Afghanistan on a number of occasions. And I, actually spent some time working for the Dubai ruler in the ruler's office in Dubai, and then wrote my book on Dubai afterwards. So got some useful insights into governance of one of these autocratic monarchies that you still see in the Persian Gulf and very few other places. Then did my PhD at Cambridge, and then focused on energy issues in that region. And then after the PhD came out, I came here to Houston, where Rice University is, and of course a big energy capital in its own right, and still work on those issues here at the Baker Institute at Rice University. So there's been a lot going on since my Energy Kingdoms book was published back in 2019, right? So we've had the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, in Turkey, in the Saudi embassy there. We've had the Saudi Aramco's IPO has happened since that book came out. We've had the attack, probably by Iran on Saudi Aramco's oil infrastructure in 2019. So, 6 million barrels a day outage of Saudi oil temporarily, but the biggest ever in the history of the oil industry. We've also had, the Trump administration come in, having this big, showdown, if you will, with Iran. And then the Biden administration coming in here in the U.S. With the sort of a rapprochement with Iran, kind of lowering the tensions a bit. But Biden then, was in a diplomatic spat with Saudi Arabia. And then we have Saudi Arabia and Iran, coming back together, reestablishing ties. Saudi Arabia and the UAE both launching net zero goals, at least, saying they plan to try and hit net zero. So the UAE in 2050, Saudi Arabia in 2060. Of course, the UAE just hosted the COP that ended last night. Saudi Arabia has always been a big presence at those COPs. And those two countries seem to be going in different directions on whether or not fossil fuels should be phased out or not. And then, of course, we have this ongoing Israeli Gaza war and the tensions that's creating. The disaster it's creating in Gaza first and foremost, but of course, the tensions around the Muslim world and beyond the global South. But really, the upending of the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel is one of the outcomes for now. So I'm happy to tackle any of these issues in the Q&A, but my book doesn't go into any of those things, especially the ones that are happening so recently. So, if you have questions on any of that, obviously happy to take them. But my book is more about energy issues among the GCC countries. The GCC, the 6 Gulf monarchies, right? So Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, and Oman. But my book is a little different than most of what you read about that region. So, normally people focus on that part of the world as a supply region that produces oil and gas and exports it to the rest of the world. My book really looks internally at them and at their own energy consumption and the politics around that. And so that's where it's a little different. So we've got 3 themes that I'm going to hit on here, and hopefully in about 20 minutes or so. So the first I'll cover is a bit of history. Then I'll look at some of their, energy consumption and some of the political issues around it. And then we'll close with the sort of the always vexing issue of climate change for oil-producing countries. Okay, so not so long ago, this is a photo of Riyadh in the 1950s. This is what it looked like in the cities of the Gulf. Okay, very underdeveloped places. Of course, they don't look, even though some of those buildings actually in this photo are still there in Riyadh, those cities don't look like this anymore, right? So this is Doha, recent photo, very close by in Qatar. Okay, here's a picture of Abu Dhabi, right? And here's what Riyadh looks like now or recently. I mean, even these pictures I've changed because these cities are changing so quickly. And to get from that first photo of Riyadh to this photo of Riyadh didn't really take that long in development terms, right? These countries developed really, really quickly. So this picture here is Dubai in the 1960s, early 60s, probably 1961 or so. That was all there was to Dubai, just that little settlement on the coast, on that little inlet. And this is what Dubai looks like now, or relatively recently, right? And this is just a little tiny corner of Dubai, actually not far from where the COP was being held, the Dubai Marina, if you've been there. So what you've had is a really remarkable level of development in a very short time, right? And I think what's even more remarkable for those of us that are interested in political science and sort of regime stability, is that these guys here on this slide, these traditional ruling families and ruling sheikhs, they are still in power. They have held on to absolute power in these countries, despite all this change and despite mass immigration to these countries. And really, they've held on to power in these places despite academic predictions that couldn't happen, that as these countries got rich, they were supposed to democratize, and that just absolutely did not happen. If anything, they've gotten more autocratic. And so I sometimes contextualize this here in the United States, saying that if you want to think about a counterfactual, think about the Native American tribes in the United States retaining absolute power in North America, despite all the widespread immigration, from Europe and elsewhere, and all the development upheaval in North America. Not a perfect corollary, right? But some, it's a way to get you started in thinking about how remarkable it is. And so the rule that these guys practice and has always, to some extent or another, required patronage, right? It's dependent on patronage, which is basically giving people stuff so they like you. I mean, in the simplest form of it, right? So to engender support from the public. And before they had oil, right? The patronage depended on the sheikhs' ability to raise funds from parties who sought access to the region, right? So that could have been foreign powers. The Brits were always trying to establish places where their ships could stop and refuel, and later their aircraft. Saudi Arabia has the Muslim holy sites, and so there were Hajj pilgrims that sought access to those sites, and they used to pay a fee, and that was the main source of revenues for the early Saudi state. So in the 1930s, there was a global competition for access to oil, and that started to zero in on the Gulf, on the Persian Gulf. And there were some big discoveries of oil in that region. So the first one was in Iran, and then the next one was in Iraq, in northern Iraq, around Kirkuk. And then the prospectors started to zero in on the Gulf, first in Bahrain, 1932, and then in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia in 1938. And it became pretty apparent that these, hermit kingdoms, as they were described back then, were kind of the perfect petrostates, the perfect place for oil development and export. You had basically just one guy in these countries calling the shots, right? The ruler, and the rule you just had, if you were an oil executive or a prospector, you had to go to the ruler's diwan and get his permission. And once you got that, that was it. You were good to go. There was no veto wielders, no parliaments, no other segments of society that you needed to persuade. There was also no private claims on the oil. There was no privately held mineral rights like we have here in the United States. So the ruler, could grant access to that. And also there was no private claims on the land above it. This was basically open grazing land, communal grazing land that anybody had access to and that the ruler could grant access to. And you also had rulers like King Abdulaziz bin Saud, or Ibn Saud here, that pictured on the slide, who were willing to cede huge concessions to international oil companies for pretty remarkably cheap terms. So this, as you can see here, this original concession for Aramco to the company that's now Chevron, is larger than Texas. 320,000 square miles of Saudi Arabia. They had exclusive access to the mineral rights there. And, of course, the geology turned out to be unbeatable. It still is. And there was also, for our purposes here, really important, zero domestic demand in these countries for oil, which meant that all of it could be exported. Oil wasn't really of any use in the region back then. Most of the transportation was powered by animals or by the wind. Sailboats. The famous Dow and the Latin sail. For cooking and heat, folks most used biomass back then. So you had these U.S. and British oil companies that won really lucrative concessions in and around the Gulf, right? And those concessions worked pretty well for at least the first few decades. But as the host governments began to understand the absolutely huge scale of this national wealth that they had basically signed over to foreign control, the terms of those concessions became embarrassing, right? And so, this 1933 concession to Saudi Arabia with SoCal, which is now Chevron, Chevron got a 60-year exclusive access to an area that was 1/3 bigger than the state of Texas, right? For $775,000, along with a pretty small royalty on any barrels that were shipped, right? 80 years later, right? So that concession has been those same oil fields have been producing now for 80 years. They're still worth something like $2 trillion US dollars if you look at the valuation of Saudi Aramco. So, an incredibly low price for that concession that Chevron got, right? So, of course, over time, as this understanding penetrated ruling circles, governments began to start changing the terms of those concessions, long before they expired, and eventually you got to the point where there was a push for full nationalization of those concessions, and foreign investors were basically kicked out. And so that happened. That nationalization process happened in the Gulf around the time of the 1973 embargo, the Arab oil embargo, which happened 50 years ago in October. We just had a big conference commemorating that 50th anniversary here at the Baker Institute. We actually had Prince Turki Prince Turki Al Faisal speaking, who's the son of the guy pictured on Time magazine here, the king, King Faisal. We had his son here, a former US ambassador to the US, speaking about it. So that nationalization period in 1973, that came about alongside this major geopolitical confrontation. You know, the Arab host countries had made an issue of US backing for Israel, and this had become a pretty serious irritant in otherwise pretty good relations between the US and those Arab countries, right? I think we're seeing that again today. That issue is not going away at all, right? If anything, it's worse. So Saudi King Faisal was particularly frustrated that his repeated requests in Washington for a more balanced approach were basically being ignored by the Americans. So in 1973, you know, during the October War, the U.S. famously stepped in to rearm Israel, help Israel defeat Syria and Egypt in that war. King Faisal was ready, and he retaliated, right? So he and the other Arab OPEC members raised oil prices. They cut off oil shipments to the U.S., and most importantly, they cut their own production by 5% a month. And their timing was a masterstroke, right? So those nationalizations that were ongoing at the time, you know, some countries had completed it by then, others completed their nationalizations shortly afterwards, and that led to some pretty spectacular results. So the embargo itself and that process of nationalizing those foreign oil concessions, that brought about a really big shift, major geopolitical and economic shift in the terms of the crude oil trade. Spectacular transfer of wealth and power from the West and these big international corporations to the East, to the host governments, these once impoverished and underdeveloped host governments, right? So you had some major effects from that, right? So the first one was, of course, the price of oil quadrupled almost overnight, right? So from about $3 a barrel to about $12 a barrel. And then the nationalization meant that a bigger share of the oil rents, of the oil profits, flowed to the exporting states, right, rather than to those Western companies. So about 85% was their take on average. You know, the combined effects of these two things meant that the amount of revenues flowing to these producer states went way up, right? So in Saudi Arabia, revenues went up by 40-fold between 1965 and 1975, you know, from about $650 million to almost $27 billion a year in that short span of time. And these Gulf monarchies, you know, and the oil exporting countries there in the Gulf became kind of crucial players, even though they were still pretty underdeveloped. You know, they were crucial players in the global economy all of a sudden, and it became pretty apparent how important their role became. You know, so this oil shock and this embargo was a crucial turning point for these countries. This windfall oil profit really made them rich. And as we know, right, there are a few indicators that predict growth in energy demand, like growth in income, right? So, you know, wealthy people and wealthy countries produce more, you know, use more energy themselves, and you know, also, you know, generally emit more, you know, more carbon emissions. So how did this all play out in domestic policy in the Gulf? Well, you know, as I mentioned, you know, these ruling sheikhs had always used patronage, you know, as part of their ruling bargains. And after the embargo, those sheikhs suddenly had a lot more patronage that they could hand out. And of course, the citizens had expectations. And so one of the most convenient forms became energy itself, cheap or even free energy at times. So in the 1970s, you had governments in those countries fixing prices for energy products and services at really low levels, so sometimes reducing them did this partly to share that windfall with their citizens, partly because, they still had pretty low administrative capacity in those governments, and subsidies are pretty easy. And they also did it partially, to solidify support for them. I mean, these political scientists have been predicting that as soon as these guys got rich, these old school monarchs were going to get thrown out, and they were going to have more democratic participatory regimes. So they didn't want that to happen, right? So they thought, well, we better share the wealth. So the prices on energy products and services were left, or they were either reduced or left untouched at levels from the 1970s until the present day in many or most of these countries. So, my own research, when I was doing this for my PhD and then later for my book, I couldn't find any evidence that any of those 6 monarchies raised prices on electricity for at least 40 years, right? So I looked at all 6 countries over, the span from the embargo to the present day at the time when I was working on that. So at least 40 years, no increase and I looked especially at electricity prices because it's easy to differentiate the price based on who's buying it, unlike, gasoline, fuel, petrol, or, diesel. You can differentiate based on who's getting that delivery. And the only changes came really when prices were lowered. So this chart here shows you, I wanted to get you to focus on the black line on this chart, the Kuwaiti electricity tariff in US cents. You can see here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in 1966, the electricity price for residential, for homes in Kuwait went down to less than 1 US cent per kilowatt hour, right? So here in the US, the average price is about 12 to 15 cents. I don't know what it is in Finland, probably 20 to 30 cents per kilowatt hour. I think Germany is paying about 35 cents per kilowatt hour. So this is less than 1 cent. This is 0.7 US cents per kilowatt hour in 1966. That is the same price that it is today. So this price hasn't even been adjusted for inflation. Kuwaitis still pay 0.7 cents per kilowatt hour in their homes. And so, very, very cheap. In fact, they don't even get a monthly bill in Kuwait. They get quarterly bills because there's not enough to collect on a monthly basis. So, academics looked at these subsidies and said, that they've been into place for so long. The academics started looking at this in the 80s and 90s, and it's still on into the, to the present day. And academics basically argued, hey, these guys have been getting this free stuff for so long. These are rights. These are rights of citizenship. The government tries to touch these subsidies. Political support is going to unravel. They're going to lose their political support, and because they're autocratic regimes, they have to keep up this patronage to stay in power. Now, of course, outside the region, oil prices and gas prices, energy prices going up and down. When those prices rose, people would change their behavior, right? So when prices were up, people would try to reduce their consumption. They would put insulation in their homes, or they might change their windows to more efficient windows. They might buy smaller cars or more efficient appliances, or just use that stuff less because it was expensive. They were getting a price signal. People in the Gulf did not get those same price signals. They didn't have any incentive to change their behavior. In fact, they had incentives to do the opposite, right? To buy more and less efficient energy consuming capital equipment, right? So because their governments were insulating them from the global price. So you had energy demand growing very quickly and really doubling or more every decade, right? So after about 40 years of this, these former hermit kingdoms that didn't use any oil to speak of became absolutely enormous consumers of energy with some of the world's highest levels of per capita demand. right? So Saudi Arabia, if you look at this chart here, the black line, this thick black line that climbs up, since the 60s, you can see Saudi Arabia. So here, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Here you can see Saudi Arabia oil consumption passing Brazil. Okay, Brazil, much larger country, much larger economy. Okay, here you can see, if you can see my cursor, Saudi Arabia passes Germany. Okay, again, a much, much larger economy. Passes Russia. Russia's a huge country, also an oil producer. And then eventually it passes Japan, okay, in 2020. So Saudi became the number 4 consumer of oil in the world in 2020. And do you know where it ranks in population? It's somewhere around number 41. So hugely disproportionate oil consumption in Saudi Arabia. They're consuming massive amounts of their own oil that aren't being exported because oil in Saudi Arabia is sold for about $5 or $6 a barrel. So it's very, very cheap. And so, the only countries that are significantly higher, have significantly more oil consumption globally are India, the blue line here, which is finally pulled away, and China and the United States, the 2 largest oil consumers. So really, shocking, number 4 oil consumer. So the extent of this energy demand in the Gulf, surprised a lot of people. Everybody always thought that this is this was a supply region, and the fact that it was also a really big demand region for energy was pretty surprising. And that's the thing that sparked my interest in this. The IEA released a report in 2008 talking about how the Gulf monarchies could no longer meet their own needs, most of them, for natural gas. And some of them were starting to import natural gas. And in fact, they're importing natural gas from us here in Texas. In some cases, the UAE and Kuwait are importing LNG shipments all the way from here, from Texas. So kind of amazing, and this kind of went against the way I was thinking about these countries. So their reserves, of course, their oil reserves and gas reserves were still really big, but an increasing share of their oil production was being diverted into their domestic markets. And since these prices were subsidized at such low levels, that was a revenue killer for these governments, right? So a barrel of oil selling for $50 or $100 outside Saudi Arabia was getting just 5 or 6 inside the country. So basically their export dependent economy was being cannibalized, right? And you had this situation where political support for those traditional rulers was bound up in those subsidies, right? And so they were afraid to take those subsidies away. They thought, could cause unrest. But the flip side was even worse, right? So if they didn't do something to reverse that oil demand growth of 7 to 9% a year, they were going to be diverting ever more of their main export commodity into their domestic economy. And those oil export revenues, they're the lifeblood of those economies and those political systems. And so those rulers knew they had to do something to get this situation under control. So I was went to the region a number of times and did surveys and focus groups when I was gathering data. And it was pretty clear that the policymakers understood this really well. And technocrats were, especially pushing them to, hey, you have to do something about this. And they started to get plans ready. But in 2011, as I'm sure remember, the Arab Spring, this pan-Arab uprisings that started in Tunisia, they broke out. And, the unrest was spreading across the Arab world. And the ruling elites were really petrified at that time. They didn't want to touch subsidies then. They thought if we start changing prices now, raising prices, Arab Spring is going to sweep into our countries too. But finally, by 2014, finally the dam broke, and there was a flurry of price increases. So this is a chart from my book. that shows, each country, actually, even beyond just the 6 monarchies, 9 countries in the Middle East took some subsidies away and raised energy prices, including some pretty big price changes in Saudi Arabia. You can see this one here, Saudi Arabia in 2016, and then in 2018, Saudi Arabia did it again. So what changed to allow them to do this? I mean, this is one of the things I get into in my book. Well, first thing happened was the Arab Spring kind of fizzled out, and you had a whole bunch of unrest, more anti-government unrest and terrorism. You had ISIS, if you remember. They started bombing mosques in the region and really kind of rallied the citizens behind their rulers for security reasons. So the rulers got, they thought, a bit of a reprieve. The citizens wanted them to strengthen security. They were less interested in democracy at that point. Second thing that happened was the price of oil plummeted. This line here is basically the price of oil. You can see it kind of fell off a cliff in 2014. And when the oil price falls in that part of the world, you really feel it. It's in the air, and you have some expectations that austerity measures are going to be needed. And then the third thing that happened was the king in Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah, passed away. He died, and his successor was a guy named King Salman, and his son, the crown prince Mohammed bin Salman, were just far less cautious in their style of rule. And one of the first things that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman did was to raise energy prices. He listened to those technocrats, and he wasn't afraid to take action inside the kingdom on this. And so he raised those energy prices in 2016 and again in 2018. And he's agreed to keep raising them, but we haven't seen that yet. So some other countries, of course, on here, you can see other countries did the same, but the Saudi subsidy reforms were the largest. So those prices are still low in the Gulf. If you go to the Gulf, you'll feel it, you'll see it. Prices on transportation fuel, on electricity and water, they're still really low by international standards, but they're higher than they used to be. So in relative terms, they're higher. And you're starting to see some changes in demand. So I get into some more detail on this in my book, but the big one is that Saudi oil demand is finally starting to plateau. So I just zero in, on the last few years. It's gone back up a little bit in 2021, 2022. I didn't have a chance to change this. But it still looks like it peaked in 2015, and it declined, a few 100,000 barrels a day. So, pretty substantial decline, which is a huge relief for the ruler there and for the economy in Saudi Arabia, that they're not going to keep cannibalizing an ever greater share of their oil production. That these subsidy reforms did help turn things around. Some of the other Gulf monarchies are starting to see a demand response. The UAE also, where transportation fuel prices were increased, they've seen about 200,000 barrel a day decline since 2017. Others are kind of up and down, not so much a response, but none of them have gone as far as the Saudis. So energy demand in the Gulf, as I write in my book, is still pretty problematic. There's still very energy intensive economies and very emissions intensive economies. They rely on fossil fuel for almost all of their transportation needs and their industrial and heating and cooling needs. Only the UAE has any substantial amount of non-fossil energy. So it's still problematic. But they're starting to turn the corner. They're starting to make some changes. And from an academic perspective, this is pretty interesting. This notion that's been kind of hammered for years in the academic literature that this cheap energy or free energy is a right of citizenship, that's been overturned, right? We're seeing it's no longer a right. Or if it ever was, it was probably some kind of, customary privilege, but not actually a right. It was never enshrined in on paper anyway. And so price of energy is back in play in that part of the world. These subsidies are still there. They're still big by international standards. And in fact, the COP, in their final communique last night, subsidy reform is on there. So these countries are coming under increased international pressure now to reform all of those subsidies and take that cheap or free fossil fuel away and try to get their consumption under control and their emissions under control. So the final piece of this talk is climate. Okay, so just as these countries were starting to have some success with one problem that they deemed existential, right? This, the cannibalization of their state revenues, they got another one, even worse, that starts to enter their radar screens in a bigger and bigger way, and that is climate change, right? And that's a much tougher problem that humanity really still hasn't figured out how to grapple with, for at least two reasons, right? So the first reason is economic, right? So since fossil fuel emissions are the main cause of climate change, any climate solution that involves selling less oil is going to cause these countries pain because their economies are just overwhelmingly dependent on oil export revenues, right? So they're going to have less oil income. That means less social welfare spending, and who knows, maybe less support for the ruling families, right? So these scenarios, like these, where they're starting to see a plateau and a decline in oil demand, are not reassuring for those regimes. The second reason why climate is so tough for these guys is that the Gulf region itself, an equatorial region, is right on the front lines of climate damage, right? The summers in that part of the world are already incredibly hot and humid. I don't know if any of you have been to the Gulf in the middle of summer, but it is pretty tough to be outside, especially during the day. We've had some crazy temperatures, 52 degrees in Basra and in Kuwait City. In 2016, we had another 52-degree reading. In 2021, we have had some, it's getting up above 50 degrees in the summer in the Gulf. If things get much worse, there's some projections that show that these cities that I've got circled on here, temperatures, heat and humidity combinations are just going to be beyond the human body's ability to cope, and they'll kill normal healthy adults. Will not be able to survive those temperatures. So if the power goes out during one of these incredible heat waves, lots of people will die. Right? This is literally deadly heat. So if you think about one of the things that this region is known for is the Hajj, right? This annual Muslim pilgrimage, where you have millions of Muslim pilgrims coming to Saudi Arabia, to one of the hottest cities on the planet, to Mecca and Medina. These are, for 2 to 3 weeks a year. These are disproportionately elderly people spending 20 to 30 hours outdoors, right? A crucial pilgrimage for the Islamic faith, but it's endangered by climate change, or threatened by climate change. Heat stress levels, as the Hajj comes back around to the summer, are pretty likely going to exceed the extreme danger threshold. So by 2070, we could see heat and humidity spikes in some of these places that are just beyond human endurance. So the residents of the Gulf, they need the world to reduce emissions, even though doing so is economically harmful for them, right? So it's sort of a lose-lose situation. I think right now in the Gulf, policymakers are still worried about that climate crisis number one, that they're going to lose revenues because of the clampdown on fossil fuels. But really, I think we need to be looking at the totality of this problem and the livability of that geography. So the COP28 showed that the UAE is starting to break ranks with some of the rest of OPEC on fossil fuels and a fossil fuel phase out. And then we see OPEC and Saudi Arabia starting to speak up on behalf of fossil fuels. So there's because their economic dependence is so acute, and those rents I think are going to be really very difficult to replace, if not impossible, because there's no business like the oil business, especially low cost oil producers in the Middle East. They're never going to replace those returns by diversifying. They're not going to replace that kind of rate of return that they enjoy from the oil business by diversifying their economies. So that's where I'll leave it. I mean, just sort of wrapping up. My book kind of concludes with some of the things they're trying to do to cope, to kind of finesse this climate problem. Trying to find non-combustion uses for oil. Petrochemicals is the biggest one. They're cleaning up their upstream. They've stopped most flaring of natural gas, and they're targeting methane now. The Saudis and the Emiratis like to tout the low carbon footprint of their oil production. So if you have to use oil, their argument is to use their oil because, after Norway, theirs is the cleanest. But Saudi Arabia still says it wants to be the supplier of last resort based on their low cost and their low emissions. Other companies are making that same argument. We're seeing some companies investing in carbon capture and trying to reduce their emissions. So one way or another, I think climate change is going to disrupt life as we know it in the Gulf. If climate action succeeds, these countries and their political systems are going to have to find another source of revenue. If climate action falls short, these guys are going to face an increasingly hostile environment. Either way, it's going to be a really big challenge for them. So that's all I've got for you. Thanks for listening. These are my two other books, if anybody's interested. And sorry I went on a lot longer than I expected to, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Krane, for this rigorous analysis of what in your expose are the oil kingdoms. I can see many teachers in the room acknowledging and using your thought-provoking counterfactuals in the classroom. Thank you very much for everything, for insightful and resourceful analysis, for thoughtful responses, frankly, for everything. Following this talk, the host's Global South Encounters will return later this month. Our last talk on the Dajin model of sustainability, which inspired the present Chinese approach to growth, sustainability, and development. The speaker will be Professor Li Hao from Tongji University in China, currently a visiting associate researcher at the MIT Sustainable Urbanization Lab. Details about the talk and our speaker will be made available on our web pages shortly. But in the meanwhile, I'd like to remind you again of our X account, our LinkedIn account, and Just Ecological Political Economy, the House's Global South blog, links to which you can see in the chat box. Feel free to comment on or share the post and use the videos for teaching. Contributions are also very welcome. Thank you so much and see you soon.